In a world already obsessed with science and medicine, about 20 years ago, stem cells took hold of our collective imagination. We began to dream of harnessing their healing powers, and since then, we've been told time and time again that the era of regenerative medicine is upon us. We've been told stem cells will cure just about every ailment under the sun. Think of a disease starting with A, AIDS, Alzheimer's, arthritis, autism, and then work your way through the alphabet. You name it, stem cells will fix it, even COVID-19. And if you need a new kidney or liver or windpipe or heart, you'll be able to grow them with stem cells. Not today, perhaps, but tomorrow or the next day or the day after that. Salvation, it seems, is always postponed, yet we keep on hoping. Each disappointment gives us a fresh opportunity to renew our faith in stem cells. And since the future lasts a very long time, there's always room to reschedule. Tonight, I want to explain what's wrong with this longing for salvation. In doing so, I'll highlight some of the risks associated with the future possible, the theme of this conference. This fixation on the future can make you sick here and now. The particular malady I have in mind is stem cell fever. Being a stem cell scientist myself, I'm in a good position to diagnose it. So let's start with a question. Why did we catch stem cell fever in the first place? I'll answer this in 4 different and complementary ways. The most obvious reason for all the hype is that stem cells really are amazing creatures. We really need to start with a definition of sorts, don't we? If you're already here, I'm guessing you have a bit of an idea about these microscopic origins of life. All cells follow certain rules. They grow and divide, but only in a binary manner. 1 gives rise to 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, and so on. Stem cells are the master builders of your body, generating all your tissues and organs and helping to sustain them throughout the course of your life. There are different types of stem cells. Those with the limited ability to regenerate organs like the liver and blood versus so-called embryonic stem cells, which can produce a whole individual. Unlike some animals that can regenerate whole organs, we humans have a limited ability to repair ourselves after disease and injury. Some of our tissues regrow, others just scar. But whatever regenerative powers you do possess come from your stem cells. The first stem cells discovered were blood stem cells, my favourites, which congregate in your bone marrow and grant you a lifetime supply of blood. It's thanks to them that you are now generating about 2.5 million red blood cells per second, to carry oxygen around your body. Blood-forming stem cells were discovered in the 1960s, but they weren't met with much excitement. Our love affair with stem cells didn't begin until the end of the century, 1998 to be precise. That's when Jamie Thompson from the University of Wisconsin-Madison introduced the world to human embryonic stem cells. Overnight, both he and they became scientific superstars. Embryonic stem cells gained celebrity status, partly because they are the ultimate stem cells, much more potent and promising than the rest. The stem cells that live in your organs, adult stem cells so-called, can only give rise to a small range of tissues and cell types. Blood stem cells, for instance, produce red cells, white cells, and platelets. Embryonic stem cells, however, can create the hundreds of different cell types that can compose the entire human body. A single petri dish of such cells can, if treated right, produce an unlimited supply of living cells of any kind. They are truly amazing. So when Jamie Thompson learned to grow them in the lab, it's like he'd captured the living cauldron of life itself. Soon people were talking about the enormous therapeutic potential of stem cells. It seemed like a new era was dawning, the era of regenerative medicine. Institutes of regenerative medicine began popping up all over the world. And this is how the man who popularised the term spoke about regenerative medicine. It has become possible for the first time to construct a scenario in which humans, he was American, may become immortal by the systematic replacement of stem cells. Death is not an intrinsic property of life. Life is intrinsically immortal. Nothing about life necessitates death. It's not just the grandeur of such claims that is extraordinary. It's also the mental gymnastics involved. In order to declare right from the start that a new era is dawning, we have to take an imaginary trip into the distant future from where we look back contentedly on our current selves with all the benefit of hindsight. From that vantage, our highest hopes look like historical accomplishments. This fantasy in which we imagine our future as already past is central to the dream of regenerative medicine. Now, my second to the four answers to the question, why did we catch stem cell fever, is that our dreams of future salvation spring from an ancient well. Humans have always imagined regenerative wonders. From the earliest myths to present-day science fiction, we find countless examples. Take comic book heroes like Wolverine and Deadpool. Shoot them, smash them, slice them up and fry them. They'll keep bouncing back as good as ever. We can trace such sci-fi superheroes to their prehistoric ancestors. For instance, in Greek mythology, we find the Titan Prometheus, who stole fire to give to humans and received a terrible punishment from Zeus. Prometheus was bound to a crag in the Caucasus Mountains, where each day an eagle would swoop down and feast furiously on his liver. Then each night, Prometheus's liver would regrow in time for the eagle's return. This gruesome ordeal has made Prometheus the poster boy of regenerative medicine. More than a few stem cell scientists have counted him as proof that the ancient Greeks somehow knew about the liver's regenerative capacity. It's unlikely that the ancient Greeks discovered the truly amazing regenerative powers of the human liver. Immortality was, after all, a defining feature of all the ancient Greek gods. All of them could recover from almost any injury, just like superheroes from the Marvel Universe. If Prometheus makes a good emblem for regenerative medicine, it's not because what the Greeks knew, but what they imagined. Through their gods, the Greeks imagined a pure, positive, eternal life. They imagined flesh and blood creatures whose vital powers were pushed beyond all limit. It's this sort of vitality that regenerative medicine promises to grant us mere mortals. In other words, stem cell research is expected to turn the age-old dream of immortality into a reality. The ancient well I mentioned feeds a fountain of youth, which is surely a major source of its appeal. My third answer to explain the spread of stem cell fever has to do with the way we moderns obsess about science and technology. Each generation seems to nominate one or other innovation as its preferred gateway to the future. Through it, we channel our hopes and our fears. The mid-20th century was nuclear. The power of the atom was, by turns, transforming the world for better or threatening to destroy it. When the Cold War ended and the fear of nuclear Armageddon subsided, we watched the rise of the computer and joined the information age. The biological side of information also captured our attention. We fell under the thrall of genetics. By the end of the century, with the Human Genome Project, it looked like we were learning the very language of life. And we imagined ourselves translating this knowledge into therapeutic wonders. When that passion seemed to go cold, we looked elsewhere for the next hit, this time with stem cells. Like a lover on the rebound, we got over one doomed affair by plunging into another. My fourth and final explanation for stem cell fever has to do with the great controversy sparked by embryonic stem cells. Pro-lifer groups were outraged that scientists were experimenting on human embryos. In their view, it was murder, a mortal sin. They did their best to have embryonic stem cell research shut down, but perhaps they inadvertently gave it a boost. Embryonic stem cells were at the centre of a culture war, with each side upping the ante. On the one hand, opponents maximised the moral harm this research was causing. They saw it as a symptom of the moral depravity that the world was sliding into, proof of what Pope John Paul II called the modern culture of death. On the other hand, those who support embryonic stem cell research have hyped the medical miracles. It will, in one sense, bring and the countless lives it might save. The more one side damned it, the more the other one praised it, so that a mortal sin became a means of salvation. Many of you would be aware this controversy over the use of embryonic stem cells has extended even to some COVID vaccines. One of the upshots of this controversy is the search for so-called ethical alternatives to embryonic stem cells. This search has gone in two main directions, carrying stem cell fever with it. First, scientists have been trying to see if they can work all sorts of regenerative wonders with adult stem cells, such as those in your bone marrow and fat. Second, scientists have learned how to reprogram ordinary body cells, turning back their developmental clock until they enter an embryonic-like state. In this Nobel Prize-winning discovery, essentially every cell in your body can become an embryonic stem cell. Both of these approaches promise the benefits of regenerative medicine without the ethical disputes and legal restrictions that surround embryonic stem cells. So now that we know a bit about what sparked stem cell fever, the question is, what's wrong with a bit of hype, or in this case, a whole lot of it? The simple answer is that hype leads to bad science and terrible medicine. The clearest example of this is the ever-growing business of selling stem cells direct to consumers. 20-odd years ago, when people began waiting for a new era in medicine to dawn, stem cell clinics started popping up. They were busy turning hype into profit by pretending that the future possible was already here and now. Their business is fantasy, but a fantasy rooted in the very real and very urgent needs of patients who are desperate for a cure and unable to wait for mainstream medicine to provide it, especially now that they've heard about the promise of stem cells. Over the years, stem cell clinics have emerged in waves, washing back and forth around the globe. Arguably, the first was a Kiev-based clinic called M-Cell, set up by a couple of Ukrainian doctors. Not long after Jamie Thompson created the first genuine human embryonic stem cells, the pair announced that they'd been injecting them into patients for a decade. Talk about being ahead of the curve. In truth, they were using cells from aborted fetuses. Near enough, good enough from their point of view. In the early days, clinics mostly sold baby magic of one sort or another, either fetal cells or blood from umbilical cords. I should mention here that cord blood does have real clinical value. Like bone marrow, it's a source of blood stem cells that can be used to treat certain blood disorders and cancers. But that's not how the clinics marketed them. They treated cord blood as a magical remedy for anything and everything. Nowadays, most shonky direct-to-consumer clinics prefer to use cell extracts from their patient's own fat, which are then injected back into them. Fat stem cells are the latest cure-all. It may appear high-tech, but like any cure-all, it belongs to the ancient tradition of magical medicine. Often, when scientists rail against unproven stem cells clinic, they highlight the horror stories. Now, it's true that a few patients have died because they've received a bad batch or so of stem cells, perhaps contaminated with bacteria. Also, a few elderly patients with macular degeneration went suddenly blind when they had fat cells injected into the back of their eyes. But such horror stories are remarkably few and far between when you consider the vast number of people who've received unproven stem cells. Though the risks are real, they're smaller than health authorities like to make. The main problem isn't that stem cell cure-alls are dangerous, it's that they're useless. They harm your bank account more than your body. A few years ago, I led a team that investigated the spread of clinics marketing stem cells directly to consumers. We were shocked by what we found. We'd expected stem cell tourism to dominate the industry. We thought that most people who could afford such treatments would have to grab their passports and head to Eastern Europe, Asia, or South America. But no, by far the greatest number of stem cell clinics is in the USA. It has 5 times more than India, its closest rival. Believe it or not, the country with the highest number per capita was Australia. But now we have closed that loophole here down under. A few years ago, the head of the US Food and Drug Administration was asked why his organisation had failed to halt the tide of unproven stem cells after many years of trying. The US Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, is the equivalent medicine regulatory body to our Therapeutic Goods Administration, or TGA. He said, and I quote, "You can't boil the ocean. You can't boil the ocean." In other words, the problem is too big, and not just in the USA. Across the globe, the industry is worth about $2 billion US a year. As I've said, direct-to-consumer clinics turn stem cells into snake oil and stem cell research into a pseudoscience. But this problem isn't confined to alternative medicine. The scientific community also struggles with it. For the last 20 years, stem cell research has been one of the hottest fields in science. It's one of those most scandal-prone also. Articles about stem cells are retracted more than twice as often than the average for biomedical literature. And most of those retractions are due to fraud. Now, I'm not talking about a lot of articles, and I'm not suggesting that stem cell research is in crisis, but I'm certainly saying that it's had more than its share of trouble. I suspect that the heat of stem cell science, the money, the prestige, and the attention it attracts encourages fraud and bad science more generally. While there's not enough statistical data to prove this claim, there is some good anecdotal evidence. There is, for instance, a growing list of scientists who became international celebrities by falsely claiming major stem cell breakthroughs. In fact, many of the biggest stem cell breakthroughs announced this century have involved fraud in one way or another. If I had more time, I'd give you all the gory details, or of course you can read it in a certain book called Flesh Made New. But here I'll simply introduce you to the most infamous stem cell phonies. First up, there is Hwang Woo-suk, who in 2004 was appointed by the South Korean government as supreme scientist for creating the first human embryonic stem cells by means of cloning. The whole world took notice. Suddenly it was possible for you and I to have our very own embryonic stem cells tailor-made to meet all of our regenerative needs. Problem was, none of it was true, and Dr. Hwang was stripped of his titles. Then there was Japan's Haruko Obokata, who in 2014 looked to have found an amazing shortcut to much the same prize. She reckoned she could make your skin cells look and act embryonic just by dipping them in a weak acid. A spectacular lie that was quickly exposed. But some scams take a long time to disprove. Take the case of the USA's Piero Anversa. For almost a decade and a half, he convinced everyone that he could use stem cells to heal heart damage. His work opened up a very fertile field of research, one that attracted lots of money and lots of other scientists, but which now looks more like a desert. Miserably, I've saved the worst for last. It's not just a case of scientific fraud, it's a medical tragedy that killed people. The chief perpetrator was a seductive and handsome Italian surgeon called Paolo Macchiarini. In 2008, he began replacing diseased windpipes with artificial ones that he'd created in a laboratory, to which he had added his patient's own stem cells. Macchiarini reported these engineered airways, once installed, would soon become living, functioning organs. Macchiarini's career went from strength to strength as he worked his regenerative wonders on patients in Spain, Britain, Italy, in Russia, the USA and Sweden. He based himself at the world-renowned Karolinska Institute, the Swedish home of the Nobel Prize in Medicine. Countless news stories declared Macchiarini a scientific pioneer, a miracle worker and a lifesaver. With Macchiarini, it felt like regenerative medicine had finally come of age. The end of the beginning had arrived. The end of the beginning. That was a phrase we heard a lot back then. We now know that Macchiarini's miracles really were too good to be true. He'd faked his results. The successes he announced so quickly were really just slow, cruel failures. Most of his patients died. Those who survived did so, it seems, in spite of the artificial windpipes he'd given them. In 2016, when the scandal broke, Sweden's Karolinska Institute was dubbed the Chernobyl of ethics, a medical research ethics meltdown. Unfortunately, the scandal extends to all the medical institutes in all the countries where Macchiarini worked. So far, none of them have properly investigated their part in this stem cell tragedy. If they did, who knows how many ethical Chernobyls, Fukushimas and etc. we'd find. What all this proves is that phony stem cell therapies are not only peddled by shonky clinics, but by the world's best hospitals and research institutes. Where are we today after more than 20 years of stem cell hype? In that time, we've heard endless promises. In a sense, the IOUs have piled up, but they're not like money in the bank. So what return have we actually had on our investment in regenerative medicine? Which therapies can we truly count on? As a stem cell scientist, I can tell you that there is only one tried and true stem cell therapy currently available. Only one. Bone marrow transplantation and its variants, all of which involve using blood stem cells to restore a patient's blood-making capacities. This therapy was developed in the 1950s, 60s and 70s by pioneers like Don Thomas, who I worked with in Seattle where I did my postdoctoral research. Since the 1980s, blood stem cell transplants have been routinely used to treat cancers of the blood, like leukemia and lymphoma. They've saved many hundreds of thousands of lives worldwide. This was the first and only big breakthrough in regenerative medicine, and it happened long before people started using that term, long before we all caught stem cell fever. But it's not all doom and gloom. To say that the dream of regenerative medicine has fallen flat does not mean that stem cell research has. On the contrary, it's thriving, and it's teaching us a great deal about how the body works and how to treat disease. Scientists have been studying living cells for more than a century, including how these cells are affected by various diseases and drugs. This sort of research is progressing in leaps and bounds. Especially exciting is the recent invention of organoids. These are cultured from stem cells and usually combine several different cell types, which spontaneously form themselves into miniature organs, mini brains, mini lungs, mini livers, and so on. Organoids provide us with a much better 3D picture of what goes on in the body than the usual way we grow cells in 2 dimensions. But they are not designed to be a path to regenerative medicine. If you are searching for a stem cell revolution, look no further than these mini organs. Sure, it's not the revolution we've all been waiting for. It's not the one that scientists and shady stem cell therapists have been waxing lyrical about. But in one respect, it is infinitely better. It's real, here and now. Though it's a lab-based revolution, its clinical implications are enormous. Stem cells have accelerated the development of new drugs across the board, making it easier to decide which ones to take to clinical trial and what side effects they're likely to have. Before closing, I want to make clear that just because the project of regenerative medicine has stalled, that doesn't mean we should abandon it. Here it is worth bearing in mind how hard it was to develop bone marrow transplantation. Nowadays, we take it so much for granted that we can hardly imagine the difficulties that Don Thomas and others contended with their slow, stumbling progress, the dreadful risks they took, and the long years of failure they endured. Given all this, it's a wonder, almost a miracle, that they succeeded in laying the foundations of regenerative medicine. We shouldn't expect that building on these foundations will require less time and less toil. It belongs to the very nature of science to create wonders out of prolonged, careful, collaborative effort. It will take nothing less to realise the promise of regenerative medicine. There is no guarantee of success, but there is certainly reason for hope.